Under the current circumstances, the Security Council has to do everything possible to make sure that there is a resumption of ceasefire as quickly as possible. We should not repeat the mistakes of before. The number of Gazans died over the recent time is so high because the Security Council was unable to make an earlier decision on a ceasefire. And this is a very bitter lesson. The suffering on people should not be used as a weapon of war, blackmail, or a lever of exerting influence on Hamas and the international community as a whole. And yet this is exactly what's happening. We reiterate our consistent and constant line for a ceasefire, the release of all hostages and detainees, ensuring there's unimpeded humanitarian access to the OPT, and their return to the peace process on the basis of the two states for the two peoples formula. Madam President, distinguished colleagues, under the current circumstances, the Security Council has to do everything possible to make sure that there is a resumption of ceasefire as quickly as possible and that there is a resumption of the implementation of the agreement between Israel and Hamas. We should not repeat the mistakes of before. The number of Gazans died over the recent time is so high because the Security Council was unable to make an earlier decision on a ceasefire. And this is a very bitter lesson that the Security Council members should learn and not repeat, because no political considerations can justify such a delay which resulted in the lives lost for such a high number of people. Since from 19th January to the 2nd of March, when the agreements between Israel and Hamas took into force, the people of Gaza saw a glimmer of hope because the access was unblocked, there was greater humanitarian activity, and the UN system bodies reported of greater supplies and the window of opportunity, despite the fact that there were low chance for further deals implementation. Unfortunately, this glimmer of hope went out as quickly as it appeared. West Jerusalem once again tightened the screws, and for 2 weeks now, the people in Gaza have been facing a blockade, and there are no prospects for it being lifted. Today, the blockade has become even more inhumane. The authorities of Israel are obstructing the work of international humanitarian organizations and agencies. They prohibit any humanitarian supplies and commercial goods coming in, and they're dooming the people in Gaza to further suffering. As far as we can say, the crossings have been closed altogether today. Cutting off the power on the 9th of March from the desalination plant, and my colleagues mentioned that is yet another instance of a blatant disregard to international humanitarian law on the part of West Jerusalem. This decision, by the way, is of no military import, but it brings hundreds of thousands of people to the brink of death because they have no access to clean drinking water. Give it some thought, please. Today, only 1 out of every 10 people in the Strip can have access to clean drinking water. The consequences of such a situation will be catastrophic, inter alia, because under these conditions there's a great risk of widespread infectious diseases. On the other hand, providing medical assistance, as we can see, are basically absent in the Strip. Madam President, And the most serious concern is caused by a continued crisis with UNRWA. The open prosecution of the agency, the Knesset decision to ban its functioning on what's being called the sovereign territory of Israel, only adds to the picture of an intentional undermining of the humanitarian response in this Strip. It's impossible to argue with how important UNRWA is for the refugees, nor can one deny that this is the UN body that's playing an irreplaceable role in providing assistance to the people in Gaza. We once again state with our unflagging support for UNRWA and recall the role the agency played in Middle East settlement, including dealing with one of the final status issues, namely the Palestinian refugees. Against this background, we hear from Israel the statement that they have some kind of a plan whereby Western Jerusalem would take full control over the supply and distribution of humanitarian assistance. There are very few details on this plan, but there is every reason to think that this plan, in case it's implemented, will not just seriously limit the operational possibilities for international bodies in Gaza, but also will undermine the 2720 mechanism which was created under a Security Council decision. It is also clear that such a plan cannot replace a large-scale UN humanitarian assistance. The situation is further compounded by the fact that Israel, as an occupying power, is refusing to shoulder the responsibility for providing the needs of the people under occupation. We can see that such notions as the care for the people or protection of civilians are not among the principles and the methods used by the IDF in their military operations, where they used heavy weaponry in the Strip and in the West Bank. And the West Bank situation is something that we are going to discuss this Friday. The humanitarian bodies of the UN have shown that they can, especially if there's a ceasefire, conduct effective work in the Strip and save people's lives. They need to be supported as much as we can and protect humanitarians from persecution on behalf of West Jerusalem, and this is purely political in nature. The suffering on people should not be used as a weapon of war, blackmail, or a lever of exerting influence on Hamas and the international community as a whole, and yet this is exactly what's happening. Madam President, we strongly condemn the measures introduced by Israel and think that their use is a key obstacle on the road towards easing the suffering of 2 million people in Gaza. And we call on the Israeli authorities to immediately lift the restrictions and to end the restrictions on humanitarian action in the entire OPT, including the Strip and the West Bank. We reiterate our consistent and constant line for a ceasefire, the release of all hostages and detainees, ensuring there's unimpeded humanitarian access to the OPT, and their return to the peace process on the basis of the two states for the two peoples formula. We are convinced that without a just and lasting settlement ensuring the legitimate rights and aspirations of Palestinians to have their own state within 1967 border with a capital in East Jerusalem, without that, a vicious circle of bloodshed and violence in the Middle East will not be broken. I thank you for your attention.